Look at the modern kitchen. Gleaming steel refrigerators humming 24 hours a day. Heavy cast iron pots costing hundreds of dollars. Digital thermometers measuring ambient room temperature down to the exact decimal. You are told by modern baking experts that creating a genuine sourdough bread requires all of this equipment. You are told that if your kitchen temperature rises above 30 degrees Celsius, your wild yeast will die, your dough will turn into a puddle of acidic liquid, and your bread will fail. You are told that without a heavy metal pot to trap steam, your crust will be dull and flat. Modern consumers spend fortunes and countless hours trying to replicate what a medieval peasant did in a mud hut. They purchase specialized refined flour, meticulously feed their starter on a strict 12-hour schedule, and perform exhausting physical routines of stretching and folding the dough. And yet, the moment the power goes out, or the moment the summer heat wave hits, the modern baker is paralyzed. The dough collapses. The bread turns to stone. The modern failure is stark and undeniable. Now strip away the electricity. Strip away the temperature control. Imagine a medieval summer in the year 1250. The ambient temperature inside a stone and timber cottage reaches 35 degrees Celsius. There is no refrigeration. There are no airtight plastic containers. There are no digital scales. There is only the raw heat of the sun and the stifling air of the baking house. Yet, the medieval baker mixed coarse dark flour with water, left it completely ignored for days in the sweltering heat, and produced a towering dark crust loaf that could sustain a laboring body for a week without molding. The medieval bread did not cause the sudden bloating and fatigue so common today. The medieval loaf possessed a thick caramelized crust that shattered like glass under a heavy knife, revealing an interior crumb that smelled of deep earth, roasted nuts, and complex sharp fermentation. It was a physical anchor of survival. The medieval success represents an absolute mastery of applied physics and microbiology achieved entirely through observation and necessity. The paradox is that the more technology we throw at bread, the weaker and more fragile our bread becomes. Modern technology focuses on quantity and speed. Medieval technology focuses on stability and quality. And the secret lies in a concept that the modern food industry desperately wants you to forget. We have traded nutritional independence for convenience and illusion. The modern bakery aisle is not filled with bread. It is filled with the results of chemical processing for speed. In order to force a mass-produced loaf of bread to rise from raw flour to a baked product in under 3 hours, factories must completely bypass the natural laws of fermentation. They rely on approved additives, isolated commercial yeast strains, and synthetic dough conditioners. These industry-standard rinses and bleaches strip the raw grain of its natural defense mechanisms. The modern white loaf is nothing more than a chemical experiment designed to maximize shelf life through artificial means while minimizing production time to increase profit margins. It lacks the structural integrity to survive outside of a plastic bag. But the medieval baker did not use chemical processing for speed. The medieval baker utilized the slow, deliberate cultivation of lactic acid barriers and osmotic pressure to create a living, breathing food source that fought off decay naturally. Have you ever had to throw away your sourdough starter because the summer heat ruined it? Or have you ever felt inexplicably tired and bloated after eating a few slices of store-bought bread? Tell me your exact experience down in the comments below. The truth about the true two-ingredient medieval bread has been buried beneath layers of commercial misinformation and unnecessary modern complexity. We are told we must knead the dough until our hands bleed to develop a strong gluten network. We are told we must retard the dough in a perfectly calibrated chilling unit to develop flavor. We are told we must bake the loaf inside a sealed iron vessel to achieve a proper oven spring. All of these modern rules are illusions born from the Industrial Revolution. They are expensive band-aids used to cover up the fact that modern flour has been completely stripped of its life force. When you mill grain in a modern high-speed roller mill, you remove the bran and the germ. You remove the very food that wild bacteria need to thrive. You are left with pure dead starch, a substance that modern bakeries must artificially inflate. The medieval baker started with whole stone ground rye and wheat. This raw flour is not just a grain, it is a biological powerhouse. It contains complex sugars, wild airborne yeasts, and natural enzymes that act as a slow-burning fuel source for beneficial bacteria. When mixed with untreated water, this coarse flour begins a violent but highly controlled microscopic war. The modern baker fears this war and tries to suppress it with refrigeration. The medieval baker harnessed this war, allowing the bacteria to construct an impenetrable fortress of acidity. This is not just a story about quaint historical cooking methods. This is a scientific investigation into lost survival architecture. We are going to examine the architecture of a bread loaf that can sit on a damp wooden table for 2 weeks without a single spore of mold taking root. By understanding the true mechanics of hydration, thermal mass, and bacterial dominance, we can completely eliminate the need for the refrigerator, the heavy cast iron pot, and the exhausting physical labor of kneading. We are going back to the origin. Let us examine the anatomy of a modern commercial loaf. Open the plastic packaging and press the white crumb. The modern crumb bounces back like synthetic foam. The modern crumb possesses a uniform, lifeless texture, completely devoid of the dense, chewy resistance found in true artisanal baking. The modern bakery utilizes chemical processing for speed to achieve the foam-like structure. Modern tech focuses on quantity and speed, while medieval tech focuses on stability and quality. To transform raw, bleached flour into a baked product within a 3-hour commercial window, modern factories bypass biological fermentation entirely. Modern factories inject the commercial dough with approved additives, dough conditioners, and isolated strains of commercial yeast. In these industry-standard rinses and isolated yeasts are designed for rapid carbon dioxide production. The rapid gas production forces the commercial dough to inflate violently. However, the rapid inflation creates a structurally weak gluten network. Because the biological fermentation is skipped, the modern bread lacks defense mechanisms. The modern loaf possesses high water activity. High water activity acts as an open invitation for fungal spores. Within 4 days, blue mold consumes the modern bread. The modern consumer must throw the spoiled bread into the trash, perpetuating a cycle of constant purchasing and constant waste. Now observe the modern home baker attempting to bake sourdough. The modern home baker purchases expensive equipment, digital scales, and electric proofing boxes. The modern home baker follows complex internet tutorials requiring the human hands to manually fold the sticky dough every 30 minutes. The modern home baker is told the sourdough must be chilled inside a refrigerator for 24 hours to develop flavor. The modern home baker is trapped in an illusion of complexity. The moment the refrigerator loses power during a summer storm, the modern home baker panics. Without the electric chilling unit, the ambient room temperature rises rapidly. The isolated yeast strains inside the modern dough multiply out of control. The hyperactive yeast consumes all available sugars within hours. The rapid consumption produces excess acid that completely dissolves the gluten structure. The modern dough collapses into a sour, liquid mess. Yet the modern method fails because the modern method relies entirely on artificial climate control and fragile, isolated microbiology. The medieval baker faced summer temperatures exceeding 35 degrees Celsius without a single electric wire. The medieval baker understood that authentic bread requires only 2 true ingredients: whole grain flour and water. Salt served as a preserving spice, not a foundational biological requirement. The true medieval magic begins with coarse, unrefined rye flour. Whole rye contains the bran, the germ, and a massive concentration of wild amylase enzymes. When the medieval baker mixed the coarse rye flour with untreated water, the medieval baker initiated a calculated biological sequence. The medieval baker did not spend hours aggressively kneading the heavy dough. The medieval peasant simply did not possess the caloric energy to waste on violently wrestling with wet flour. The medieval peasant utilized the physics of time. The technique is known in scientific terms as autolysis. When water hydrates the raw flour, the naturally occurring enzymes activate. The enzymes act like microscopic scissors. The enzymes slowly snip the tangled protein chains within the flour. Once the protein chains are snipped, the protein chains naturally align and form strong cross-linking bonds. The cross-linking bonds build a robust, elastic gluten network entirely on their own. The medieval baker simply mixed the coarse rye and the cold water into a shaggy, wet mass, covered the wooden trough, and walked away. No folding, no kneading, just raw enzymatic physics doing the heavy lifting. The rough, sticky paste slowly transformed into a smooth, elastic muscle without a single drop of human sweat. But how did the medieval dough survive the blistering summer heat without rotting or turning into liquid? The answer lies in thermal mass and competitive biology. The medieval baker placed the fermenting dough inside thick, porous clay pots or heavy wooden troughs. The medieval baker placed the heavy clay pots on the stone floor of the coolest room. The thick walls of the clay pots acted as a natural thermal battery. The thermal mass absorbed the ambient heat of the baking house, keeping the interior of the clay pot significantly cooler than the surrounding air. The thermal mass created a stable microclimate for the wild microbiome. Inside the cool, dark interior of the clay vessel, a war for survival commenced. The wild yeast and the naturally occurring lactic acid bacteria began to consume the complex carbohydrates. As the lactic acid bacteria consumed the sugars, the lactic acid bacteria excreted a powerful defense mechanism. The lactic acid bacteria created impenetrable lactic acid barriers. The lactic acid barriers caused the pH level of the dough to drop significantly. The acidic environment tightened the protein cross-linking, making the dough incredibly resilient against the summer heat. Simultaneously, the fermentation process altered the internal moisture dynamics. The process lowered the water activity within the dough. Lowering the water activity creates an environment with extreme osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure is a deadly force against invading pathogens. If a modern mold spore landed on the medieval dough, and the high osmotic pressure immediately sucked the moisture out of the mold spore. The mold spore dehydrated and died upon impact. The medieval dough became a self-sterilizing organism. The true two-ingredient medieval bread is a masterpiece of survival engineering. The medieval baker allowed the dough to ferment slowly over 48 to 72 hours in the clay pot. The extended fermentation time allowed the lactic acid barriers to fully mature. The mature lactic acid barriers predigested the complex proteins and carbohydrates. The predigestion neutralized the chemical compounds that cause modern consumers to experience severe bloating and digestive distress. The modern consumer feels sick after eating factory bread because the modern consumer is forcing the human stomach to digest raw, unfermented proteins. The medieval bread was entirely predigested by the lactic acid bacteria. Observe the physical decay of the modern commercial loaf. When the approved additives finally fail, the chemical processing for speed reveals a terrifying reality. The modern white bread does not simply age. The modern white bread rots. The modern white bread turns into a toxic, green sponge. The high water activity and the lack of lactic acid barriers provide a perfect breeding ground for dangerous pathogens. The modern consumer assumes all bread must be kept in a plastic tomb to survive. Now, observe the aging process of the medieval sourdough. The medieval sourdough does not rot. As the days pass, the medieval sourdough simply loses moisture. The thick caramelized crust acts as a natural shield, locking the internal moisture while protecting the crumb from external spores. The osmotic pressure within the medieval loaf remains high. If the medieval bread is left on a wooden table for 3 weeks, the medieval bread becomes incredibly hard, like a solid brick of nutrition. The medieval bread becomes a survival ration. The medieval traveler could place the hard bread into a pot of boiling stew. The boiling stew rehydrates the robust cross-linking structure. The medieval bread absorbs the savory broth, returning to a chewy, satisfying meal. The medieval bread is a testament to the superiority of biological engineering over modern chemical shortcuts. The medieval peasant survived because the medieval peasant relied on the invisible army of wild microbiology. An army that modern society desperately tries to eradicate with industry-standard rinses and artificial environments. Let us consult the academic record to validate the medieval survival architecture. The modern consumer often dismisses ancient practices as primitive superstition. However, researchers at the University of Helsinki have extensively analyzed the microbiology of ancient sourdough cultures. The researchers at the University of Helsinki discovered that the specific strains of lactic acid bacteria cultivated in coarse rye flour create impenetrable lactic acid barriers. The lactic acid barriers actively dismantle the complex gluten proteins, pre-digesting the heavy molecules before the bread ever enters the human stomach. Furthermore, studies from Stanford University on food preservation highlight that lowering water activity and increasing osmotic pressure are the exact physical mechanisms required to prevent modern fungal pathogens from colonizing organic matter. Modern tech focuses on quantity and speed, while medieval tech focuses on stability and quality. The medieval baker achieved the optimal water activity and the optimal osmotic pressure not through chemical processing for speed, but through raw time and environmental manipulation. The archaeological evidence perfectly mirrors the biological science. Look at the excavated ruins of ancient bakeries in Pompeii, or the remnants of 12th century communal ovens scattered across rural Europe. The modern home baker assumes a heavy, expensive cast-iron Dutch oven is mandatory for baking artisan bread. The modern home baker believes the cast-iron pot is the only way to trap moisture and create a thick crust. But the ancient Roman bakers and the 12th century European bakers did not possess individual cast-iron pots for every single loaf. The ancient bakers utilized the physics of the communal brick oven. The massive stone walls of the communal oven absorbed extreme heat. When the ancient bakers loaded hundreds of raw dough loaves into the searing hot stone chamber, the moisture evaporating from the raw dough hit the scorching brick ceiling. The evaporating moisture instantly transformed into dense, thick steam. The ancient bakers sealed the heavy wooden oven door. The dense steam remained trapped inside the brick chamber. The trapped steam blanketed the baking bread. The steam kept the exterior crust soft during the first 20 minutes of baking. Keeping the exterior crust soft allowed the internal gases to expand violently, creating a massive, airy loaf. The ancient bakers mastered steam-trapping physics, rendering the modern Dutch oven completely obsolete. We will now reclaim this lost knowledge. We will eliminate the confusing imperial measurements. We will utilize the precise metric system. We will use grams and degrees Celsius to ensure absolute scientific accuracy. The first step requires the modern survivalist to build the biological engine from nothing. The modern survivalist does not need to purchase dehydrated commercial yeast or isolated laboratory cultures. The modern survivalist needs raw organic rye flour and unchlorinated tap water. Rye flour possesses the highest natural concentration of wild microorganisms. On day 1, the modern survivalist mixes 50 grams of dark rye flour with 50 grams of water inside a simple glass jar. The modern survivalist leaves the glass jar in a warm, dark corner resting at roughly 25 degrees Celsius. The modern survivalist does absolutely nothing for 48 hours. By day 3, the mixture will bubble vigorously and smell of overripe fruit. The modern survivalist then discards half the mixture and adds 50 grams of fresh rye flour and 50 grams of water. The modern survivalist repeats this feeding process for 7 consecutive days. By day 7, the wild microbiome is fully established. The wild microbiome is now a highly active sourdough starter, ready to dominate any raw flour the wild microbiome encounters. And the second step is the preparation of the true 2-ingredient dough. The modern survivalist mixes 500 grams of coarse wheat flour, 10 grams of preserving sea salt, and 350 grams of water with 100 grams of the active rye starter. The modern survivalist mixes the components into a ragged paste. The modern survivalist does not knead the paste. The modern survivalist simply covers the wooden bowl and allows the autolyze process to align the proteins automatically. After 12 hours at room temperature, the rough paste transforms into a smooth, strong sphere. If the modern survivalist lives in a tropical climate exceeding 30 degrees Celsius, the modern survivalist simply utilizes thermal mass. The modern survivalist places the dough inside a thick ceramic crock. The thick ceramic crock insulates the dough from the ambient heat spikes, slowing the bacterial feeding frenzy and ensuring the lactic acid barriers form correctly without dissolving the fragile gluten structure. The third step is the execution of the open bake. The modern survivalist will bypass the expensive cast iron Dutch oven entirely. The modern survivalist places a thick baking stone or a heavy steel plate on the middle rack of the standard home oven. The modern survivalist places a secondary shallow metal tray on the very bottom floor of the home oven. The modern survivalist fills the shallow metal tray with small, clean volcanic rocks or heavy metal bolts. The rocks and metal objects act as a thermal battery. The modern survivalist preheats the home oven to 250 degrees Celsius for 1 full hour. And the extreme heat fully saturates the baking stone and the volcanic rocks. When the oven is violently hot, the modern survivalist slides the fermented dough directly onto the hot baking stone. Immediately, the modern survivalist pours 1 cup of boiling water directly onto the scorching volcanic rocks in the bottom tray. The modern survivalist slams the oven door shut. The boiling water hitting the 250-degree rocks creates an instantaneous, explosive burst of dense steam. The explosive steam completely fills the home oven. The steam replicates the exact physical conditions of the 12th century communal brick oven. The steam envelops the cold dough. The moisture prevents the crust from setting prematurely. The extreme osmotic pressure inside the dough pushes outward, causing the loaf to expand dramatically. And after 20 minutes, the modern survivalist carefully opens the oven door to release the remaining steam. The modern survivalist lowers the oven temperature to 210 degrees Celsius. The modern survivalist bakes the loaf for another 25 minutes in the dry heat. The dry heat caramelizes the exterior sugars. The dry heat hardens the crust into a thick, protective armor. The resulting bread possesses a deeply blistered mahogany crust that shatters audibly when cut. The interior crumb is highly gelatinized, wildly open, and packed with pre-digested nutrients. Let us examine the mathematics of this survival architecture. The modern consumer purchases factory bread weekly. The factory bread requires continuous financial output. The factory bread contains approved additives that offer empty calories and promote digestive inflammation. The modern home baker purchases a $200 cast iron pot, a dedicated electric proofing chamber, and expensive artisan tools. The medieval survival method requires an investment of $0 in specialized equipment. The medieval survival method requires only flour, water, salt, and the intellectual mastery of applied physics. By understanding thermal mass, water activity, and vapor mechanics, the modern survivalist transforms the standard home kitchen into an ancient bakery. The modern survivalist stops relying on the chemical processing for speed. The modern survivalist builds a permanent, self-sustaining biological engine that will outlive any modern appliance. The knowledge is the ultimate asset. The knowledge cannot be broken by a power outage. The knowledge cannot be compromised by supply chain failures. The true two-ingredient medieval bread represents ultimate food sovereignty. Look back at the modern kitchen. The modern consumer stares at the glowing digital screens and truly believes the modern consumer has reached the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. The modern consumer views the medieval peasant as a primitive brute living in darkness and ignorance. But the historical reality proves the exact opposite. The medieval baker was not a primitive brute. The medieval baker was a master of applied physics, a master of thermodynamics, and a master of wild microbiology. The medieval baker did not force nature to comply with chemical processing for speed. The medieval baker collaborated directly with the invisible powerful forces of the natural world. Modern tech focuses on quantity and speed, while medieval tech focuses on stability and quality. The modern factory relies on fragile global supply chains and synthetic-approved additives to produce a weak, lifeless foam. The medieval household relied on generational wisdom, physical thermal mass, and the deliberate cultivation of impenetrable lactic acid barriers to construct a biological fortress. The modern food industry has successfully convinced the modern consumer that basic survival requires absolute financial dependency. The modern food industry dictates that baking a simple loaf of bread requires purchasing highly refined white flour, purchasing isolated commercial yeast packets, purchasing electric refrigeration units, and purchasing heavy cast-iron Dutch ovens. This engineered dependency strips the modern consumer of all true capability. Consider a catastrophic power outage during a blistering summer heat wave, and the modern consumer watches the electric refrigerator power down. The commercial yeast inside the modern plastic bowl over-ferments instantly, turning the modern dough into a puddle of foul, acidic rot. The modern consumer throws the ruined dough into the garbage, completely helpless without constant electricity. In stark contrast, the medieval craftsman in the identical summer heat wave simply relies on the thick clay pot. The physical thermal mass of the unglazed clay pot absorbs the extreme ambient heat. The lactic acid bacteria regulate the internal pH of the medieval dough. The resulting extreme osmotic pressure repels the airborne mold spores naturally. The medieval dough continues the slow, majestic transformation, completely indifferent to the environmental chaos outside the stone cottage. This is not just primitive cooking. This is absolute mastery over the physical environment. The medieval peasant survived centuries of harsh winters, brutal summers, and systemic societal collapse because the medieval peasant understood the fundamental laws of osmotic pressure and water activity. The medieval peasant did not buy survival. The medieval peasant engineered survival from raw earth, raw grain, and raw water. The physiological impact of these two divergent paths is undeniable. The modern consumer eats the factory bread filled with industry-standard rinses and experiences immediate lethargy and digestive inflammation. The chemical processing for speed creates a highly profitable product that actively attacks the human digestive system. The modern consumer must then purchase expensive pharmaceutical pills to fix the biological damage caused by the modern factory bread. The medieval craftsman eats the dense, dark rye sourdough. The powerful lactic acid barriers have already pre-digested the complex heavy proteins during the 72-hour fermentation cycle. The human body absorbs the raw, dense energy seamlessly. The true two-ingredient medieval bread acts as preventive medicine, dense nutrition, and long-lasting fuel combined into one perfect self-sustaining structural unit. The simple act of mixing coarse rye flour and cold water is not merely a culinary recipe. The simple act is a profound physical rebellion against the fragile, toxic modern system. By refusing to use the electric refrigerator, by refusing to purchase the expensive cast-iron pot, and by refusing to perform the exhausting, unnecessary kneading rituals, the modern survivalist reclaims lost historical independence. The modern survivalist stops being a passive, dependent consumer. The modern survivalist transforms into a highly capable, self-reliant craftsman. The true craftsman understands that authentic quality requires the physics of time, not the frantic, destructive acceleration of industrial machines. The true craftsman knows that a dense loaf of sourdough possessing low water activity and robust lactic acid barriers will sustain human life long after the modern supermarket shelves sit empty and barren. The knowledge of the true two-ingredient medieval bread is the very first step out of the artificial modern matrix. The modern world wants the modern consumer weak, chronically sick, and entirely dependent on the next corporate grocery delivery. Do not accept this fragile, pathetic existence. Reclaim the potent scientific wisdom of the medieval ancestors. Master the physics of the local environment. Build physical thermal mass in the home kitchen. Cultivate a fiercely independent wild microbiome. If the modern survivalist is ready to abandon the chemical processing for speed and embrace the eternal, unbreakable laws of nature, the modern survivalist must take immediate action today. Strike the subscribe button. Join the growing ranks of the self-reliant craftsmen. Step out of the modern illusion, reclaim the forgotten science of survival, and walk the medieval way.